Thank you so much, Alvin. And let me make sure that I get to share my screen, which is always a moment of anxiety for me, even after all the time I've spent doing that. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. So this paper is really, it's from the perspective of a literary historian, and it's focused on a small example that I would argue has larger significance. The beginning of this thinking can be traced to my visit 4 or so years ago to Sigmund Freud's apartment and his former consultation rooms in Vienna in Berggasse 19. That was a profound experience for me. Seeing the rooms where he spent hours every day seeing patients. His consultation hours were from 8 to noon every day, and then after dinner from 3 to 9 p.m., except when he was ill, is a moving experience. Freud lived 70 years in the same city, more than 40 years in the same house. He did his reading in the same armchair and his writing sitting at the very same desk that you see here, one day resembling the next, as if they were twins. An existence as carefully maintained as his famous beard. I was also reminded of the day, June 4th, 1938, to be precise, when these routines were ruptured. And he, to save his life, boarded a train that took him to Paris, from where he then left for London. I also remembered the fact that 4 of his 5 sisters perished in concentration camps in Treblinka and Theresienstadt. My visit coincided with the publication of Frederick Krus's massive 2017 biography, Freud, The Making of an Illusion. Here's the Freud that we get in Krus's book. A ruthless peddler of cocaine and a failed physician, Freud spent a lifetime touting his own achievements and overcharging his patients, while showing a voyeuristic interest in the sexual lives of his patients. A retired Princeton English professor, Krus relates Freud's personal flaws directly to his shortcomings as a scientist. Indeed, the former are the cause of the latter. Critics were entranced by Krus's book. From the Washington Post to the New Yorker, Freud, The Making of an Illusion was hailed as something like the final word on Freud, the fraud. An old pun Krus successfully revived, and that was made even more explicit in the cover that was used for the British edition of Krus's work. The American paperback of the biography carries a celebratory endorsement taken from a review by Louis Menand, the New Yorker's in-house oracle on things cultural. Krus has driven, Menand wrote, a stake into its subject's cold, cold heart. He has an amazing story to tell. As if Freud were a vampire overdue for killing, and Krus the man who'd gotten the job done. The chorus of approval attended even to tamer academic venues such as the Journal of Austrian Studies, where the reviewer professed their excitement that Krus had exploded the myth of Freud as a victim of anti-Semitism and given us the facts about a swindler who had insinuated himself into upper-class Jewish society for his own gain. In tenor and argument, these reviews were at times virtually indistinguishable from similar ones published in outlets on the right or even the far right. And I apologize for that. Next slide. The Daily Stormer ran extracts from Krus's book. Kyle Smith, writing in National Review, was hardly able to contain himself with praise for Krus's reputation-pulverizing work that had exposed Sigmund Freud as a liar and a misogynist. When the National Review sounds like the New Yorker, or the New Yorker like National Review, something surely is afoot, and I'd like to focus on this a little bit on, as I said, a small example from the perspective of a literary historian, but that might have larger significance when we think about it. Critics might like to think of Frederick Krus as a kind of iconoclast, but he really isn't. He has been at the Freud is fraud game for quite a while and with remarkable effectiveness. But the Library of Congress mounted a major exhibit, Sigmund Freud, Conflict and Culture, in 1998. He was allowed, along with W.H. Auden, a quote from the famous Auden poem, "He was often wrong," to have the last word. And this is from the last panel. Psychoanalysis will fade away just as mesmerism and phrenology did, and for the same reason. Its pretensions will deprive it of recruits. And Kruse hasn't been at it alone. One of Freud's chief accusers in this regard is the former Sanskrit professor Jeffrey Musayev Masson, Jewish himself, formerly the golden boy of the Freud estate and entrusted with the editing of Freud's unpublished letters. As he grew into his role, Masson had a change of heart and set out to destroy his former idol in a book called The Assault on Truth, Freud's Suppression of the Seduction Theory, 1984, in which he blamed Freud for cowardly pandering to the Jewish elites of Vienna. It was their influence and money that made Freud abandon the seduction theory in which he originally believed and rebrand traumatized patients as hysterics fantasizing about imaginary sexual violations. In other words, he replaced facts with fiction, encouraging his patients to tell stories rather than the truth. Masson, who often seems more like a fictional character than a real person, subsequently became one of the protagonists of the late Janet Malcolm's sarcastic book, The Freud Archives. A far less subtle witness for the prosecution was Freudian Fraud, the malignant effect of Freud's theory on American thought and culture by E. Fuller Torrey, MD. The author is a psychiatrist known for advocating forced medication as a treatment for mental illness, traced the undeserved success of psychoanalysis to all those exiled Viennese doctors. If one had to thank anyone for importing Freud to the United States, it was Hitler. A more recent addition to the list, one that I remember well, since I used to know him from the Harvard house where I was a member, is the late psychiatrist Armand Nicolai's The Question of God. C.S. Lewis and Freud debate God, love, sex, and the meaning of life, which led to a popular PBS series praised by Ken Burns. Of course, the debate Nicolai stages doesn't end well for Freud. While Lewis corrected his early errors and embraced Christ, Freud, a sad sack filled with self-loathing and loathing for other people, materialistic to the core, didn't have the inner resources to become kind and charitable. Nicolai acknowledges the impact of anti-Semitism on Freud's life, but then in an interesting move undoes the argument by pointing out that Freud saw anti-Semitism everywhere, which essentially invalidated the argument. It is remarkable to what extent these more and often less academic attacks on Freud reflect popular culture portrayals in cartoons, where Freud appears as money-grabbing and opportunistic, or even music. In 1960, for example, to use an older example, the Chad Mitchell trio toured the US with an anti-Freud song, The Ballad of Dr. Sigmund Freud, that had a refrain that you see here. Well, Dr. Freud, oh, Dr. Freud, how we wish you had been differently employed, but the set of circumstances still enhances the finances of the followers of Dr. Sigmund Freud. Since so much in Kruse's argument hinges on what he calls the facts and on the charge that Freud fabricated much of what he's known for, I would like to look at two key moments from that book. My goal is here is not to rescue Freud or to engage with legitimate concerns about psychoanalysis or even Freud's practice. Rather, I want to understand the persistence of these often very personal attacks directed against him and see what larger significance they have. My first example comes from a pivotal passage in the book, Kruse's description of Jung's first visit to Freud in March 1907. On that occasion, Jung also participated in a meeting of the Wednesday Psychological Society, an informal circle of doctors and laymen interested in psychoanalysis that met at Freud's house. In Kruse's rendition, this group was filled with, quote, obstreperous admirers, nearly all of them Viennese Jews, and all drawn to radical ideas. They were mediocrities through and through, he says. And they regarded Freud as sacrilege, as he indicates, as a kind of false messiah. False from Kruse's perspective. Freud himself disdained them, as Kruse asserts by mentioning a remark that Freud is supposed to have made to one of his visitors. the young Swiss psychiatrist Ludwig Binswanger. Freud called them the gang, or as he paraphrases it, a sorry lot of crackpots. It's important that this doesn't show up in Binswanger's book. Rather extraordinarily, while Kruse appears to share his subject's disparagement of those disciples, he also uses Freud's contempt for them as further evidence of his flawed character. But if one looks at the context of what Binswanger actually wrote, and it's a short book, so it doesn't take long to get through it, one finds that he cited that remark not with a disparaging intention, but in order to show how sadly isolated, how lonely Freud was at the time. The Wednesday meeting that is of particular interest to Kruse took place on March 6, 1907, the day Jung and Binswanger stopped by. Alfred Adler, who was presenting that evening, related a story of a patient, a stutterer, whose symptoms included the habit of submerging himself in water until he had counted either to 3 or to 7 or to 4. And Kruse chooses this particularly odd story for a purpose. A discussion followed in which these numbers were, following a suggestion by Otto Rank, related to the size of genitals, with Freud, shockingly from Kruse's perspective, assigning the smallest number to the Christian genitals. Here's Kruse ventriloquizing Jung and Binswanger. They couldn't believe that such a display typified the man they were getting to know. But did Jung, who plays an important role in Kruse's account, perhaps because of his later rejection of Freudian psychology as too Jewish, really say that? It so happens that we have detailed minutes of these meetings, 4 thick volumes, so we do know what in fact happened that night, and that account sounds quite different from Jung's summary, and from Kruse's summary, and you got the passage here. Dr. Jung remarks that he's unable to make any extensive criticisms because he's just beginning to familiarize himself with Freudian ideas. In the original German account of what Jung had said that night, he sounds even more differential. Jung apparently said he had just begun, an den Freudschen Ideen heraufzuklettern, which means something like ascending the slope of Freud's ideas. Now, it's always possible that Jung was just saying these things to please Freud. But if Kruse enjoys privileged access to the inner workings of Jung's mind, he fails to tell us how he got there. If Kruse adjusts the biographical evidence to suit his preconceptions, he's unsurprisingly also a less than generous reader of Freud's writings. My second example from Kruse's book comes from the pages Kruse devotes to the book Freud regarded as his most important work, The Interpretation of Dreams, Traumdeutung, first published in 1899. When it attracted relatively little notice. We know that he had problems writing this book. He shared those with Wilhelm Fliess, his confidant from those years, a Jewish general practitioner with a flourishing practice in Berlin, who is dismissed roundly by all biographers for his eccentric theory that there's a relationship between anomalies of the nose and the patient's sex life. However, in his discussion of Traumdeutung, Fliess suddenly emerges, in Kruse's discussion, suddenly emerges as a knight in shining armor, a stalwart defender of empiricism, who suggested changes that would bring Freud's eccentric book into closer proximity to the mainstream idiom of science. And Kruse otherwise rejects Fliess too, but he's very convenient for him in this particular context. As Kruse sees it, Freud had written Traumdeutung mainly for the purpose of self-aggrandizement. Including so many of his own dreams was not a consequence of being wary of sharing his patients' case histories, but an indication of narcissism. But if self-aggrandizement was the goal of the interpretation of dreams, what a shattered mirror we get in this book. Traumdeutung is full of references to books that remain unfinished, or are torn up. One of the most famous dreams in Traumdeutung, one of Freud's own dreams, is the dream of the botanical monograph, in which Freud finds himself turning the pages of a botanical textbook, finished the way his own book was not and would never be. It was Freud's hope that the act of interpreting dreams would be an act of healing. But when it came to writing down his interpretations, the opposite seemed to happen. Instead of tying things together, associations proliferated, resisting closure. resisting the closure that the writing of the book requires. What's worse, the analyst tears himself up in the process of writing them. In a particularly frightening dream, Freud reports, Freud dissects himself, or rather watches himself dissecting himself, using his scalpel, a stand-in for his pen, to cut himself to pieces. The self-referential nature of these passages, rather than being an example of Freudian egomania, preserves his anxieties of authorship, encouraging readers to be open about their own anxieties. For Cruz, such details are, to use his own words, sophistry. And sophistry is, as the New Testament reminds us, anathema to the true Christian, as demonstrated in Colossians 2:8, where Paul the apostle warns his listeners not to be taken in by empty philosophy and deceit, which are based not on Christ, but on the ways of the world. There's indeed an underlying, unconscious perhaps, distorted Christian narrative at work in Cruz's biography and in the critique of other folks, of Freud's all too Jewish theory. Cruz, like Nicolai, believes that Freud exaggerated the impact of anti-Semitism on his life. But there's no denying the fact that he grew up in a climate that was anything but friendly to Jews. Anti-Semitism constantly rears its head in Traumdeutung, notably in the uncomfortable memory of his father, Jakob Freud, and an incident he mentioned to his son that happened when he was still in Galicia. A Christian passerby who thought the Jew Freud had no business being on the pavement intentionally knocked his hat into the mud, whereupon Jacob meekly stepped into the street and picked it up. Throughout Traumdeutung, Freud thus reminds his readers that he was indeed a Jew and an outsider. And even if those reminders didn't further harm his prospects of advancement that he so much wanted, according to Cruz, Freud would have known that they would do nothing to facilitate them either. It is worth remembering that Berggasse 19, the unremarkable four-story building where Freud lived and practiced for so many decades, was not too far away from the second district, where Vienna's poorer Jewish population, including Freud's parents, lived, and where he himself had gone to school. If Berggasse at one end gently rises towards the goal of Freud's aspirations, never fully achieved, with the hospitals and the University of Vienna, Freud became a full professor only in 1920. It descended at the other end into the Tandelmarkt, where Jewish peddlers had sold their wares since the middle of the 19th century. Freud, the son of an unemployed former wool merchant from Galicia, lived halfway between the two poles of his existence, between his lowly origins and the hope, never completely realized, of full acceptance. As we have seen, Cruz fudges the facts to accuse Freud of fudging the facts, and I could provide more examples for which I don't have time. An ultimately self-canceling procedure that by itself cannot be and isn't the real goal of the book. As Janet Malcolm has argued, psychoanalysis touches a raw nerve in all of us. And I quote, "To fully accept the idea of unconscious motivation is to cease to be human." But that is not how Freud saw it. Traumdeutung is above all a celebration of the infinite possibilities of interpretation opened up by the insight that is more to each one of us than meets the eye. It models and encourages delight in the capacities of the human mind and the forever unfinished play of associations. As Stefan Zweig pointed out a long time ago, the value of psychoanalysis, however flawed, can no longer be tied to the question of therapeutic success or to debate on whether or not elements of the theory have held up to scrutiny. There's something else at stake, and that's what I would like to argue. Well, these attacks on Freud, hidden under a deceptive veneer of academic rigor, and it's our responsibility to be aware of that, that makes it difficult to identify anti-Semitic undercurrents rushing through them. What these attacks really take aim at is not Freud. What they dispute, whether deliberately or not, is the right of a brilliant Jew, however flawed he might have been, and thereby perhaps the right of any Jew, to have shaped and laid claim to a culture that has made us all who we are. Thank you.